At the end of February 2019, we traveled to Tokyo for the first time. We arrived at Haneda International Airport on a wonderfully clear evening, with Mount Fuji silhouetted beautifully by the vibrant sunset. We were both very tired, and my initial plan to take the monorail and metro was changed in favor of a taxi to our hotel in Nishi Kasai neighborhood. We didn't realize it would be a $100 taxi ride, but that's how you live and learn. I'm not completely full of complaints because the ride was very enjoyable. We got to see a lot of the city before we actually stepped out to explore it, and we saw a lot of the landmarks that I was planning on having us visit. So that got me really excited because it's like, oh look, there's the Tokyo Tower, oh look, there's the big Ferris wheel that we're going to go on. I was super pumped even though I was totally exhausted, and I had my camera going the entire time just filming as much as I could. On our first day, we decided to head to Tokyo Station, where we were going to catch a Shinkansen out of town. It was very easy to navigate Tokyo Station for the very first time at 6 in the morning. There's nobody here, it's quiet, it's calm, it's relaxing, really easy to figure your way around. The planning for this trip was very last minute. I gave myself about 5 weeks total to actually figure out what we were going to be doing. And it was a lot of work because I decided to do the trip 100% independently. So there were no travel agents involved, there were no tours booked, we were just going to go there and explore the city on our own. But I wanted to make sure that there wasn't anything that I missed. It was a very important trip for both of us because, for number one, we'd never been there, and number two, we just celebrated 20 years together. So we wanted to do something grandiose and special, and I figured that visiting one of the cities that we'd always wanted to go to for the first time would have been the perfect idea. The day started by taking a Shinkansen, or bullet train, west out of Tokyo. I had originally planned to just stick to the city as we only had a week there, but a few days before we left, I realized we could easily spare an entire day to seeing some of the countryside. I had also really wanted a reason to ride a Shinkansen because they seemed to be really, really cool, so this was just perfect. We weren't traveling at the train's top speed since we were only traveling to Shizuoka, but it was still very fast, and occasionally I felt a little bit dizzy trying to track all the houses just flying by at such a high rate of speed. In theory, we would have had really amazing views of Mount Fuji from the trains during the first half of our journey. But unfortunately, it was really foggy and hazy, and the mountain was completely invisible, even though you could kind of see some blue sky and some sun. So it turned out the only time that we saw the mountain was that sunset view from the plane. You know what that means? That just means we have to come back and do it again someday. We then transferred to the Fujikawa Express on JR Minobu line, but I actually made a mistake in not confirming that we had the express ticket, which I didn't realize was a separate purchase. So we boarded the express train with just a regular fare ticket. The poor conductor didn't speak any English at all, and I didn't speak any Japanese at all. But fortunately, through translate apps, we were able to understand each other. He was really, really kind, and he let us continue on to Fujinomiya Station, which was as far as the cash we had in our pocket would allow us to go. There we disembarked and upgraded to the proper fare so we could take the express all the way to our first destination, which was Minobu. It was very enjoyable to be able to travel the countryside by train, because it's not really a thing that exists where I live. It almost felt like a privilege to just get onto a train and travel between towns and not have to worry about navigating or driving or anything like that. Our stop for the day was in a little town called Minobu to visit Kuon-ji Temple on a mountain known as Minobu-san. The local bus information was not readily available online in English, so my planning was leaving me a little stressed. But I fortunately had a friend who was able to find the bus timetable in Japanese. And it turned out that the bus from Minobu Station to the temple was timed to match with train arrivals, which made visiting the temple very, very convenient. The buses had a bit of a tricky time maneuvering through the narrow streets of Minobu, but they managed, and it was very impressive to see them actually be able to do it. Minobu was a sleepy and quiet little town up in the mountains. There were other people visiting the temple that day, but there weren't very many. The solitude that we ended up experiencing there was really, really nice. One of my goals when I arrived at the temple was to climb the Stairs of Enlightenment, which was 287 stone steps up a steep slope that led to the main temple complex. I had unfortunately contracted Lyme disease a few years ago, apparently, and it had made it very, very difficult to be as active as I was. And I knew that my body was going to have a little bit of difficulty on these steps, so it was going to be quite the challenge for someone like me. But it was very, very important for me to do this, not only to just be like, hey, I climbed them, but also to see exactly where my body was physically, so that I had an idea of how much more work I needed to do to get myself back into the shape that I was in before I got sick. I did make it to the top of the stairs with a little bit of rest. The temple grounds themselves were gorgeous and silent. You could just hear the wind rustling through the trees. Our delayed arrival at the temple meant that we had to make a decision. Either we were going to skip the cable car and try and move on to the other temples that we wanted to see, or we would take the time to go up the cable car, have a nice, relaxed visit of this temple instead of rushing it, and decide to not go forward to visiting the other temples for the day. And we ultimately decided to just stay here and enjoy it because it was such a wonderful atmosphere. It was really difficult to leave. You really didn't want to rush through a place like this. It was just too perfect. As the morning had progressed, you could see that the haze and the fog had definitely thickened more significantly than it was when we were riding on the trains. So even from the cable car, there was zero chance of seeing Fuji to the east. The misty and foggy mountains and valleys were incredibly gorgeous regardless. There was no reason to be disappointed in missing just one single mountain. There were just so many other beautiful ones around us to enjoy. On the summit of Minobu-san, there was maybe half a dozen other people with us. It was so silent and so peaceful. Exactly what you would want a temple like this to feel like. Kuon-ji is famous for its cedar forest. The forest itself is mostly about 250 years old. There are a number of cedar trees that are actually over 700 years old. And it was these trees that inspired the founder of the temple to build at this particular location. With such a significant elderly population in Japan, it's obviously very important for temples like Kuon-ji to have something like cable cars to keep it accessible to absolutely everybody. There was even a miniature version from the main parking lot up to the main temple complex on the lower parts of the slopes. Kuon-ji Temple was initially founded in 1281, but most of the buildings on grounds date back to the 1800s because there was a fire that unfortunately had damaged or destroyed all of the initial buildings. But to maintain the cultural heritage of the temple itself, they rebuilt the structures according to their original designs. After a few hours, it was time to head back to Tokyo. I did take the stairs, but... So, I made it up and down the steps, and since I've been like bedridden for the better part of 3 years, I can't really walk right now, but David's here. He'll always support me. He's the best. It turned out that my legs were very, very weak, and I nearly collapsed walking a couple of times back to the bus stop. It was a little scary, I admit, but I needed to know exactly what shape my body was in. And it also made me realize that if I had rushed and tried to get to the other temples, it would have been a waste of time because for the rest of the day I was just too weary to walk anyway. So the rest of the trip was basically just taking the train back to Tokyo. But instead of going the same direction that we had come from, we continued on north and to the east. We continued north on the Fujikawa Express, transferring to the Chuo Main Line in Kofu. So ultimately, our first day in Japan was a full circumnavigation of Mount Fuji by train, which initially was what we had planned, just only one stop instead of 3. And the day was so long we ended up not only leaving in the dark, but also arriving back in the dark as well. Now my plans for accommodations ended up being fairly ridiculous and very Japanese. Our first hotel was a dinosaur robot hotel, which was utterly ridiculous, but also super amazing and hilarious because I'm a huge nerd for dinosaurs, and also just really tacky Japanese stuff. Anyway, that concludes day 1 of our week in Tokyo. The second day ended up also being very, very busy, with a lot of walking, but I somehow managed it. See you there!